In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we praise and thank you for being able to gather here tonight to learn more about our faith, to allow you to draw us closer to yourself. We ask that through this evening that we might seek to know you, to know your Son, Jesus Christ, in the power of your Spirit. We ask all of this through Christ our Lord. Amen. And we'll pray together the Our Father. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. If for any reason you can't hear me or I didn't enunciate well, just let me know. I won't be insulted. So, all right. So we started maybe in kind of a weird way, in a sense. But if you're joining a family, it's probably good to be able to go through the family album a little bit, and kind of have a little sense. And family life is beautiful. But family life can sometimes be a little interesting. There can be some unusual aspects. There are some characters that are usually in families, extended families. So we shouldn't be shocked to find similar things in the church's history. So that's one of the reasons we're going through this, is to kind of get a sense of, joining the family, it's not all, roses and butterflies, and it doesn't always, now, this is where it's not our family, okay, it's God's family, and because it's God's family, then on one hand, it's perfect. We'll get into that when we talk about that the church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, but suffice to say that at least the part of the family that's here on earth, we're a bunch of sinners. So it shouldn't shock us. And in some respects, I'm doing this to give a little bit of a context in today's culture, what we're dealing with maybe right now, which I'll kind of come back to at the very end here. It's also to give you a few, pegs to hang things on, just so it's good, like I said, it's good to know a little bit of the family history, okay? Where we've been, where we're going, and all that kind of stuff. So, and I could have started, which we will at some point, relatively soon-ish, we'll be kind of looking at the, basically the pre-Christian history, okay? And that being the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament is our family history as well. It's just kind of the roots, if you will. And there's even sometimes more weird stuff, and you always have to remember in the Old Testament, God is trying to lead a pretty broken people to himself. Sometimes he has to allow a lesser evil to prevent a greater evil. So you think, how in the world could they have so many wives, or this or that? Well, not exactly, we'll get to that. So, but that's the prehistory. We didn't really get into it. But so one of the interesting points that I like to drive home, which we're not going to really take the time to do that tonight, is that if you look at the prehistory, and in certain details, i.e. in the Davidic kingdom, okay, so you've got King David and everything like that. There are a couple, in King David, that's the high water. Well, King David and his son, Solomon, okay, it's the high water mark for the Old Testament. We won't get into all the details of that tonight, but there are key figures, or maybe I should say key positions in that Davidic kingdom that you're like, oh, when you start to see, you're like, holy cow, I didn't even see. You see the transition. You see as the Davidic kingdom is laying the foundation, or I should say God through the kingdom of David is laying the foundation for God's kingdom, okay, which on earth here the seed and the beginning of that kingdom is the Catholic Church. So, not enough time to get into all those details tonight, but it's a very, I think, beautiful and very connected history. But we're just kind of hitting some of the big points. Not every historian, not every church historian would maybe agree with, okay, this is how you break church history down, but I mean, it's 2,000 years, there's a lot of things going on. I'm just kind of hitting some of the points that I think are big. And I think most people would agree with most of them. Maybe a few differences, but just as a quick little synopsis, okay, so first point that I, was kind of emphasizing the historical reality of Jesus Christ, okay, and the historical reality of his, what do we want to say, his decision, that's not right, but his will to found the church, his church, okay. So that was point number one. Point number two, okay, the apostolic age of the church, where the Holy Spirit is guiding the church in an utterly unique way. We'll get into this hopefully maybe not next week. We'll get into this eventually, where divine revelation from God is still occurring through the apostles. So, ends with the death of the last apostle, as I mentioned, probably St. John, about the year maybe 99, 100, something like that. That ends divine revelation. Okay. From that point forward, it's just for the Holy Spirit to guide the church to help us understand and come to a deeper appreciation and to live this revelation out. So that apostolic age with the workings of the Holy Spirit through the apostles, utterly unique in church history. There's nothing that's even comparable. I mean, obviously, Jesus Christ, is not comparable, but that's utterly, utterly unique. But that apostolic age after the ascension, so ascension and Pentecost begin the apostolic age, and then it's the death of the last apostle. So that was point number two. The third point, and it really shouldn't, if you think about it, if Jesus Christ is who he says he is, okay, which he is, resurrection proves that point. Okay. Jesus Christ is who he says he is, and if he founded the church, and if there is an enemy, all three of those points are true, completely biblical. Well, what do you think the enemy would want to do? The enemy really cannot do anything against God. So the devil is going to attack, basically his spiritual children. He's going to attack his kingdom. So it should not shock us that, holy cow, there's persecution. Actually, there's persecution, and we read about this in the Acts of the Apostles, beginning with the death of St. Stephen, the first martyr, that it should not shock us that the enemy is attacking the church. So the first persecution begun in Jerusalem with the death of St. Stephen, and it spread out, but that was a little bit more local. I mentioned that the third point was the Roman persecutions, which there is some evidence. I don't know it well enough to actually say it. I do not want to even remotely sound like I'm anti-Semitic, because I'm not. The Jews are our older brothers and sisters in the faith. But there is some evidence to suggest, maybe support, I guess, that possibly that persecution that began against the church in Jerusalem and there were elements of that kind of helped spur some of the beginnings of the Roman persecution. Scott Hahn talked about it. It was one of those things like, oh, that's really interesting. But I didn't remember enough of it to actually talk intelligently. So those two persecutions are not necessarily completely separate, but that's neither here nor there in a sense. The first persecution, okay, and when I say that it was not all the Jewish people. We don't want to categorize or miscategorize. There were people who were Jewish who started the persecution. in that sense. We just kind of go from there. The Roman persecution, okay, as I mentioned, began under the Emperor Nero. This was not a persecution that was empire-wide all the time. But the first 3 centuries of the church, a lot of things that were happening, the church was doing in those first 3 centuries. But if you're, first of all, illegal to exist, it's against the law for you to exist, and you have periodic persecutions coming through in different places, and you never kind of know when it's going to creep up, it kind of stymies your efforts, if you will. And then the last 3 persecutions under the emperors Decius, Valerian, and Diocletian, which are about 50 years, so roughly 250 to 300. A little bit of a wiggle room on each side of that, but
you're what? 50?
Maybe 250. I am not good with dates, so I'm thinking it might be 254, 256. Maybe it is 250. It's right around the middle part of the 3rd century. Up until, now it wasn't continuous, but these, under the Emperor Decius, and the Emperor Valerian, and the Emperor Diocletian, these were the worst of the persecutions, and they were, for the most part, empire-wide. Okay. Under the Emperor Diocletian, the only place where it didn't really hit hard, or not a whole lot, was, I think, in sort of the, I don't know if that was kind of in the what we would call Great Britain, in that area. That was where, I think, it's where memory serves me maybe poorly, because I think that was where the soon-to-be, eventually to be Emperor Constantine, his father, who was a high official in the government, that's where he had jurisdiction, and he didn't really commit himself to that persecution. But the persecution under Diocletian, this is where, when I said, entire villages were wiped out. In fact, they had to, there is Roman testimony to where, I think it was the historian Tacitus who would say, maybe it was, anyway, Roman testimony said actually it was, so many people were killed that they had to replace the executioners because they would just be exhausted, and they would actually, the axes, the implements used to cut their head off, eventually they would just break. It was just, it was just so many people. Anyway, so Diocletian was the worst. So the third point, the Roman persecution.
I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
Decius.
So it's, there's different ways. So D is in dog, E-C-I-U-S. Some would say Decius, some would, if you're in classical Latin, in more ecclesiastical Latin, church Latin, it's Decius, or Decius, or, and then Valerian, V-A-L-E-R-I-A-N, I think.
Yeah.
And then Diocletian. Diocletian was the worst. And that ended around, for the most part, maybe 304. This was in the first couple years of the 4th century. So the third point being the Roman persecutions, like I said, shouldn't surprise us. The church is being attacked. The enemy is on the prowl, as St. Peter warns us. And then the peace of Constantine, or the Edict of Milan in 313. So under a series of circumstances, which were really kind of interesting and very providential and miraculous as well, the Emperor Constantine, the General Constantine, becomes the Emperor Constantine. And then he is the Emperor of the West, and there's the Emperor in the East, and without going into all kind of, they kind of meet and they say, all right, we're going to allow the Christians to exist. So the Edict of Milan in 313. So that is a game changer. So you go from being, illegal and potentially hunted down to now you are legal. Okay. And Constantine's mother is a Christian. Okay. Saint Helena. So after this is the fourth point. I mentioned about the age of heresies. It's not that heresy, and heresy is a wrong understanding, or we could call it a heterodox understanding of the faith. So, for example, one of the worst, and this was probably one of the worst times in the church's history, that was in the time, especially in the 4th century, even into the 5th century, was the Arian heresy. I mentioned before about that. That was when it denied the divinity of Jesus Christ. Kind of a death blow to everything. Okay, and a lot of people, unfortunately, became Arian for a lot of different reasons. Back in the day, sometimes they were purists. They're like, hey, we just believe this. But oftentimes, that era on forward, maybe even you could even say in today's, sometimes it was more political because it had to do with power, but we're not going to get sidetracked on that. So this is a time when the church is really moving out, okay, because they're no longer, suppressed and under threat of persecution, right? Although the Emperor Julian decides to go back, and he basically apostatized from the Christian faith, and he began persecution, but he didn't last very long. Anyway, that's a whole other story.
Who was that?
The Emperor Julian, known as Julian the Apostate. He was the last of the Roman emperors who tried to go back to the pagan ways.
Do you know the time frame of that?
That would probably be, I'm thinking, I'm going to take a guess and say mid to late 4th century. Somewhere right in that kind of period. Could be. I'm not mathematical, so dates don't necessarily always stick in my brain. But this is a time where it's not the first time where the church has endured the wind of heresies. Not going to be, certainly wasn't the last. But this is a time where the church is trying to understand, what does it mean that God is triune but one? What does it mean that Jesus Christ is both God and man? All these different things. What are the inspired books of the Bible? There was a heretical group that said that Old Testament, it's old. We don't need it anymore. It's all done. No more Old Testament. The church said, "What? Wait, you can't do that." So all kinds of different things, all different variations of the theme. So age of heresies, and 4th and 5th century was particularly, it was a rough time. But the church, through the guidance of the Holy Spirit, hammered out, okay, this is what it means that we believe in one God, 3 persons, 3 divine persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but one God, etc., etc. So the 5th point was the fall of Rome, the beginning of the Dark Ages. The fall of Rome, told the story a little bit, 410, okay? And this is really where the Western Empire, and Constantine at this point has already moved the center, the seat of the empire, to the city that he named after himself, or he built and named after himself. Kind of had a whole new beginning. It was kind of building the city anew. So, known as Constantinople, humbly. And that would lay the seeds, which we'll get into in just a little bit, that will lay the seeds for the split between the East and the West. But now known as Istanbul in Turkey. So, and this is when all the barbarian tribes, Germanic tribes, are kind of swarming through the western part of the empire. And the beginning of the Dark Ages is not because the church was repressing, people and knowledge and this and that. The church actually was the only one in the West who was actually preserving reading and writing and all the different things that you would kind of. The barbarians, they're barbarians. They're called barbarians for a reason, okay? So this is, kind of the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th century, a long time. This is a rough time in the West. Not as much in the East. They didn't have this, although it's coming. It's coming in the East. Through a different set of barbarians. And kind of under this, they got a whole bunch packed under this. So you got the fall of Rome, the beginning of the Dark Ages, and the church doesn't say, oh, this is bad. This is bad, we're just going to sit here. The church does not circle the wagons and hunker down and we'll just hope for a better day. The church is like, well, what are we going to do? We're going to convert them. So this is when the church has an amazing missionary spread. This is where you start having the conversions of so many of these different tribes. Some of them had already been converted, but they were kind of Aryan and were actually persecuting the faith. It was kind of a mixed up mess, but as I said last time, the big conversion, really at this point, was the conversion of Clovis and the Frankish people, because these were going to be, they were the first of the Germanic tribes that were truly, you could call them Catholic Christians. They were just truly Christian, and so they became the protectors of the church in the West, because there are lots of others, they're barbarians. I mean, they're looking for anything to a certain degree. So, and also under this is the rise of monasticism with Saint Benedict, because that was instrumental in really preserving. I mean, it was the monasteries that preserved the culture, the Western culture, and especially in this time period in the Dark Ages. So, my sixth point.
When you were talking about the monasteries last week, we were talking about it afterwards. Was that kind of the birth of colleges then?
It's a good question. Well, let me give an answer without directly answering that question with a yes or no. So, monasteries were absolutely centers of learning.
Yeah.
And this is where, the arts, reading, writing, etc., were preserved. This is where science actually, agriculture, all the kind of stuff. I mean, this is what civilized. Without Western monasticism, and Western monasticism, you can never ask a question to get a simple answer. Western monasticism is different than Eastern monasticism. Okay? Eastern monasticism, so St. Benedict in the 6th century, I think, he didn't start the monastic movement. That was started several centuries before in the East, in particular in the deserts of Egypt. Eastern monasticism, in particular in Egypt, it's a little edgy, at times. These are the stories where, you hear about, somebody, for example, on the lesser extreme, fasting for long periods of time, or, and then on the really more bizarre, like they were monks who would build a pillar and they'd live up there for years, or they'd live in a tree, called them dendrites, I think, for years, or just kind of like, that's kind of odd. Well, it was kind of odd, And Irish monastics, anybody who's Irish here, and the Irish monks did a heck of a lot of good. So I'm not ragging on the Irish.
Yeah.
But the Irish monasticism was influenced by Egyptian, Eastern monasticism. So you've got a little more extreme monasticism in Ireland. Whereas St. Benedict was just like, you know what? We need to sleep enough, we need to eat enough, and we need to divide our life between prayer and work. Western monasticism under St. Benedict was just this kind of what we would call a via media of sorts. It was the middle way between just licentiousness and like living life, for today, etc., and that real extreme, like, okay, we're not going to sleep ever, we're gonna, and Benedict was like, we're just we need sleep, we need to eat, we need to have balanced prayer and work, and that's one of the reasons why it caught on like fire. And it spread throughout Europe. Modern day Europe and beyond. But that's why I think it was so effective to preserve culture and to, what would you say, not invite, but to, it was attractive to the Germanic barbarian tribes, because it wasn't some whacked out kind of like, extreme, version of life. I mean, it was certainly not there, it wasn't exactly how they were living life. But it was just, there was something that was very regular, very ordered, very common sense kind of, stuff. So that they were centers of learning, of scientific discovery, of agricultural industry. I mean, the monasteries were huge. I'll tell you a little story. See, nothing's ever simple with me. Back in the let's see if I can remember all the details of the story. So this is back in England, right before Henry VIII cut off ties with the church and made himself head of the church and screwed up the whole thing. So, what was it? They have done archaeological findings or discoveries of some of these. It was either one or a couple, several Benedictine monasteries in England that Henry VIII shut down because basically it was a huge land grab, but we'll get to that in a little bit. These monks had something to do with the way it would be what would bring about the Industrial Revolution, because of the ability, it's something to do with burning coal effectively, something, I can't remember the details. They had discovered this, I don't know, when was the Industrial Revolution? I mean, probably, if this is in the, let's just say, the beginning parts of the 16th century, Industrial Revolution had to be at least, late 18th century?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're talking, a good 300 plus years. If Henry VIII had shut down those monasteries, England probably would have been the world power par excellence. I mean, it would have just absolutely revolutionized. Anyway, it's one of those interesting little factoids where people are like, oh, the church has always been against science. That has been one of the most ignorant statements ever. So back to your question. So there always were the places of scholarly kind of a scholarly center. But the universities, one of the major thrusts for the universities was through the cathedral schools. So the schools that the church ran connected to the cathedrals of these different dioceses throughout Europe, trying to promote learning. Eventually they grew, and that's a very simplistic way to kind of put it. So definitely the Benedictine monasteries influenced that, but if memory serves me correctly, a more direct ancestor, if you will, were the cathedral schools. Once again, run by the church, supported by the church, promoted by the church. So, short answer to your short question.
Could have been longer.
Could you know me well. So, all right. So my sixth point, and I'm going to go into detail because I already into some detail last time. It's the rise of Islam. This is in the 7th century. Their halt in the year 732, Battle of Tours, by Charles Martel, pivotal, absolutely pivotal, would more or less keep them at bay from coming into Europe probably for another 300 years, 250. They'd already swept through a lot of the East. They had severely threatening the Eastern Empire, Constantinople and others. They've swept through Northern Africa. Northern Africa used to be an absolute stronghold of the church, no longer. Swept through Spain, and they were stopped right over the Pyrenees Mountains. So we'll talk more about them in a moment. So that's kind of where we're at. So point number 7, if you're wondering how many points are there, like 30 points here? No, there's only actually 17. So we're not quite halfway, but this was, so remember kind of what you're looking like. I'm going to do it sort of, I guess, the correct sort of. So you got the Western Empire over here, kind of in shambles. You don't really have a lot of structure. The only really structure you've got is the church. Okay, you've got some little bits and pieces and things but you don't really. And so in the East, you've got Constantinople, you've got the emperor, and sometimes the East is going to help the West, and sometimes they totally ignore them, and sometimes, honestly, they got so many battles to fight on their end with Islam pressing against them that they don't have the ability or the resources, and this is why the church turns to first the Frankish kingdom, okay? And so you've got, Clovis, you've got the line of Clovis, no, Sonia, you probably know the Merovingian. Okay,
Yeah.
okay. They kind of proved to be sort of not the greatest. They kind of fall apart. And like a long story short, there are some who are kind of the prime ministers of the kingdom. They write to the Pope and like, hey, if we're doing all the work, shouldn't we be like the king? And the Pope says, yeah, makes sense to me. And so they become. And so you've got names like, Pepin the Short, but the big one, Charlemagne. Charlemagne is, in some respects, this is one of those high points. Charlemagne, the beginning of the kind of the Holy Roman Empire. Okay. Remember, the Holy Roman Empire does not include Spain. Spain's under the domination of the Moors, of the Islamic. So Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne. He's a son of the church, but he's also, he's one of these Germanic chieftains of sorts as well. So he's a bit rough around the edges and kind of does some things that, maybe that wasn't the best way. He does some conversion by sword, and so this is Charlemagne or Charles the Great, Carlos Magnus, and this is the time where Europe, modern day Europe, is united. And now it kind of falls apart but this Holy Roman Empire, okay, which really is the one of the forces to help civilize what we know as modern day Europe. Okay, the Holy Roman Empire, technically, it begins in 800, the crowning of Charlemagne, and it goes until 1806, when it was dismantled by Napoleon. So it's got a 1,000-year run, if you will. And Charlemagne is kind of the high point. You're like, well, gosh, because it was all united under Charlemagne. And then Charlemagne after he died, his sons took it over, and it just kind of, and then you had, throughout kind of this period of time, you've got, there's a kingship that develops in England, there's a kingship that develops in France, and then you've more or less, remember, Spain's kind of on her own until the late 15th century, when they finally moved the Moors out. But then you've got the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire is kind of geographically in a lot of those areas, those sort of Germanic areas. But this is sometimes it's great, and sometimes the Holy Roman Emperor is the worst enemy of the church. Sometimes he's wonderful, and sometimes he's a total idiot.
So this is when you're saying that the East and the West is united.
So the East is still they look at the Holy Roman Empire like, what do you mean you crowned it? The emperor is over here. Creates more friction between, but the West is like, we need someone to protect us. Because also at this point, you also have the Huns coming down from the eastern steppes, and you've got, Genghis Khan, tell the Hun, Genghis Khan, you got some nasty people, and the West is saying, hey, we need help, and this is not just like, oh, there's a tax levy against us, or there's an embargo. No, it's just called rape, pillage, slaughter. We're killing everybody. So it's not like the West can just say, well, and the church, you've got, who's going to protect, the monasteries? You got the Vikings coming in from the north, sweeping through. The Vikings are coming down into Paris. They're looting Paris. The Vikings were off the scourge. The Huns, so the church in the West, the Holy Fathers, the Pope is like, we need somebody. It shows the church didn't want to be running society. The church just wants to run the church. We're going to do church things. The running of the culture, the running of society, that's somebody else's job, so to speak. And so you need law and order. You need governance. And like I said, the church did not want, versus Islam, just throw this in here, Islam, the structure of society and It's a theocracy. The religion is running everything. The church, the Catholic faith is not a theocracy. The Catholic faith just says, no, we want to influence, we want to inform, we want to sanctify culture, and all those in the culture, but we were not told by Jesus to run, society. We're going out to baptize all the nations, and they'll run the society. We'll help them, we'll guide them, so they know, oh yeah, we shouldn't be killing these people, or we should do this or that, or we should look out for the widows, or whatever it may be. So really, the church and the popes are like, we need some help here, And that's why the Pope actually made a very bold, kind of ticked off the West, or the East, I'm sorry, when he crowned Charlemagne. I don't remember which Pope it was. And then we successively, went in that direction. And like I said, it kind of fractionalizes after Charlemagne, and you've got the Frankish, the French kingdom, you've got the English kingdom, you've got, different, it's not all perfect by any means. But one of the things is that society is starting to be civilized, okay? And the church, one of the beautiful things that's happening is the church is influencing and saying, no, you can't just go there and kill all these people. You can't. That's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. Or you must. I don't care if these people aren't part of your group. You have to defend them. Okay. And so this is the beginnings. The whole issue of knighthood. Okay. This isn't the high point of knighthood, but this is. These are barbarian warriors. They need guidance, and one of the things the church does is saying, you know what, you can use your skill set, so to speak, to actually protect, and we'll start by protecting the church, protect the monasteries, the men and the women who are completely defenseless, protect these villages, etc., etc. So it was good in many ways. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is. You're on this side of the grave. So, all right, so this is, first 1,000 years. At this point, everyone who is Christian is Catholic. And everyone who is Christian recognizes the Pope. Total unity, okay? Well, I mean, it's not perfect, but, it's total unity. So everybody in the West, so you've got all these different places, and, in the East, that isn't yet been Muslim Islamified, the places that are still, the holdouts in the East. Okay, so what happens in 1054? This is point number 8.
Okay, could I?
Absolutely.
7. What was the kind of main point of 7?
The Holy Roman Empire. The
Holy
beginning.
Roman Empire. Okay.
The beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. So you could say kind of.
I'm not alone on that one.
Yeah, just the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. And how that really brought, once again, not perfect, but it began to bring a greater cohesiveness and civilization to the West. Okay. And protected the West from, like I said, the incursion of the Vikings and the Huns and all sorts of different, although technically Attila the Hun was before this. It's interesting. This is a good example. Attila the Hun, this is probably in the, I'm just going to say, I don't know if it was 5th or 6th century. Let's say 6th century. So what he was referred to as the scourge of God. I mean, they were brutal. Swept through. They're at the gates of Rome. And no public official in Rome wants to go out. So the Pope Leo the Great at the time, he wasn't known as the Great then. He's Pope Leo the First. He's the first one. We know him as Saint Leo the Great. He's the only one who was willing to be like, well, then I'll go out. He goes out, with a few of his clerics to bargain with Attila the Hun, the scourge of God. Historians don't know exactly what happened there, but somehow Pope Leo got this godless, whatever you want to fill in the blank with, man and his hordes to turn around.
Wow.
Now they would eventually come back, and it didn't go so well. But anyway, so yeah. So what was called the Great Schism. Schism is, so it looks like it's schism, but it's more pronounced schism. S-C-H-I-S.
So this is point 8.
This is point 8.
Okay.
This is in 1054. Long story. So you've got the East, Greeks, their Eastern mindset. They have the new, what they call the New Rome, okay, Constantinople. They kind of hold the power in many ways. You got the West, their Latin, Western culture. They've got the Holy Roman Empire. Lots of cultural differences, language differences, this and that. This, unfortunately, was almost, I think, inevitable. It's very unfortunate. But in 1054, through a series of events, and I don't want to miscategorize them, there were, in the East, there was a bit, in the history of the early church, there were what they call four patriarchies, okay? 4 major ancient cities that had very ancient bishops, let's just say. For example, one was Antioch. Well, the first bishop of Antioch was actually St. Peter himself, St. Peter the Apostle, okay? Jerusalem, well, the first bishop of St. Jerusalem was St. James, okay, one of the St. James, the Apostles, okay? Alexandria, these were like the 4 main cities in the ancient world. So it would be Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, and then Alexandria in Egypt. Okay? Those 4, the apostles went to, and they planted the seeds of the church. Okay, so those are the 4, really big, what we call apostolic sees or patriarchs. Well, Constantinople isn't really one of the 4. It's a Johnny-come-lately. The only reason that it was anything is because Constantine built the city of his power there. And in a sense, they've always been kind of like, hey, yeah, but Rome might be important, but after all, we are just about the same, or we're on the same level. And the church is like, what? No. And they also kind of got a lot of what they call Caesaropapism kind of going on there. So the bishop in Constantinople and the emperor in Constantinople, a lot of times they were very intertwined. Make a long story short, in 1054, basically there was a break. So if you've ever heard of, like, say, for example, the Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Coptic, Orthodox, etc., etc. So the Orthodox and the East and the West split. The biggest thing, there are cultural kind of things, but the biggest thing was the East did not want to recognize Rome as the first of those ancient sees, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and even if you throw Constantinople in there. So they don't recognize the Pope. They would just say, he's the first among equals. Okay, so they don't recognize what we call the Petrine ministry in the church. Okay. We'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about the Pope. So all of the East, the whole Eastern Empire splits off. Okay, now about 400, I always forget my dates, 4 or 5 centuries later, there's a whole bunch of people in the East who say, well, we want to come back. We want to be under the Pope. And the Pope says, great, we'll bring you back. You can stay. So there are those. So in the church, you have Roman Catholics or Latin Rite Catholics. That's, predominant, And then you've got Eastern Rite Catholics, okay? So you have Greek Catholics and you have Ukrainian, Catholics. they look, and then you've got the Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Coptics, etc., So the Eastern Rite Catholics, they look exactly like the East, but they're under the Pope. If that doesn't make complete total sense, as I didn't explain it very well, that's okay. Don't worry about it. But yes.
You used a term, Cicero-Popism. What is that?
You see that in Constantinople, in the Eastern Empire, where the religious authority and the political authority are too closely united, let's just put it that way.
Okay.
You don't know, is this the church speaking or is this the emperor speaking, or, simply put. So, huge, the great schism between the East and the West, not a good thing. We don't want that. It'd be wonderful if we were brought together again. Only in God's knowledge. I don't know. A lot more that can be said about it, but there's actually even more fractionalization happening in the East. It just happened recently with the whole Ukrainian thing, and now it's a mess. I don't know. I don't know if it will ever. Only God might mend those fences, but the East is totally Catholic, in the sense they got all the sacraments, they have bishops and everything. It's, the main thing, they don't recognize the Pope. So, which we'll get into in much more detail later on. So, number 9. Here's one of the real controversial issues, and that is the Crusades. Usually most people, if they know anything about the Crusades, it's usually pretty negative. It's hey, isn't that where the church, slaughtered men, women, children, dogs, cats, gerbils, everything? Well, no. There were, the Crusades went from 1095 to 1270. There were 8 official crusades. There were other crusades that were launched that the church never sanctioned. Actually, they condemned. I think there was one called the Peasants' Crusade, which was a complete disaster, a slaughter of those peasants. The Children's Crusade, once again, the church condemned those. So why did because people think, the Crusades, it's horrible. Well, we have to understand, in the year 1095, here's the situation. Pope Urban, I think it's the second, recognizes, all right, this is not good. Islam is intensely on the march, okay? Islam has, and when I say Islam, I guess you should say the Muslim Empire, which is, refrain from any comment. So they had a major part of their army wiped out. The Eastern Empire is hanging by a thread. They're like, help us, we need help. It's just kind of ironic because oftentimes when the West said, hey, we need help, and the East was like, no, we're too busy, But Pope Urban II understands, look, this is bad. We are, if we don't do something, basically this is self-defense, okay? Now, the Crusades, these, first of all, they're not above criticism. Were there mistakes made? Yes, there were mistakes made. But most of the Crusaders, especially, most of the Crusaders, a lot of times the idea is that the Crusaders were just bloodthirsty and they're out for their own gain. Actually, a lot of Crusaders never came back because they were killed, So you risked everything. Crusaders had to, put out a lot of money to get all the equipment to go to the Crusades. And there was no guarantee of any kind of success. Most of the Crusaders, and they have this in documentation, written documentation that has probably come more recently to light, most of the Crusaders did it for religious reasons. A way of, some of them did it a way of making recompense for their sinfulness. you know. Some of them did it, you know, out of the sense of duty to protect, you know, the innocent and the weak and the, you know, and the initial crusades were much more successful than the latter crusades, militarily speaking. But no matter how you look at it, it's interesting. Even today, it's amazing how little we know of history and how much the Muslims know of history. Because they will remember, they know 732, Battle of Tours, Charles Martel. They know about the Crusades. They specifically know these are the men that prevented us from taking over the world. That's actually a story, it's a synopsis of a story that I just heard recently. The Crusades, for all of their faults, like I said, there were definitely faults, okay? But there were a lot of valiant men who put everything on the line in order to protect Christendom. With the Crusades, what happened in the Crusades, it probably protected the West for at least another 300, well, if you look at it from the very beginning, for about 500 years. It pushed back the Muslims because which, you know what, I think I forgot to write it down. I can't remember when exactly, but at one point, the Eastern Empire falls, okay? Now, one of the Crusades, and it's, you know, you think, wait, didn't they sack Constantinople? You know, yeah, they did. There are some, it's kind of a complicated story. That wasn't the best thing. The church didn't want that to happen. There were political reasons. It's kind of a very mixed up mess. Not only that it was good that it happened, but it just caused some really, really bad feelings. Let's just put it that way. That are very, very well known today and completely unforgiven. In fact, many years ago, my sister, God rest her soul, dated a man who was Greek Orthodox from Cyprus. They remember. They remember about the sacking of Constantinople. Very fresh in their memory. The Eastern people do not forget. Whether they're Islamic or they're Orthodox, they do not forget these things. We kind of just move on. They're just like, what happened? I don't remember that. That was centuries ago. You know, it's irrelevant to us, but it's very relevant to them. Not the best thing, but the Crusades definitely did more good than bad, I think, by far. You know, and in some respects, you could say the Crusades was a great moment. It was when actually, you know, Christendom said, all right, we're not going to take this sitting down. We're moving forward. You know, and it's interesting, the First Crusade, most of the kings were excommunicated, you know. Sometimes there was you know, the church was not afraid to say, hey, you can't do that. You got to repent, you know. And fortunately, some of these kings were complete idiots, and you know. But it's a complicated time. There was a lot of good that happened. There were some things that weren't so good. But we got to keep all these things in perspective. So my next point. Oh boy, the brakes aren't here. So yeah, I guess. Well, I just get wrapped up here. So yeah,
We don't need a break.
Break time.
we'll take a break.
So Brenda's here with us tonight, and she has some goodies out there for everybody if you want to get something to drink, something to eat, and to visit.
So
And
how,
I know, did we do any
how do we stop
introductions
this?
for our new people tonight?
No, we didn't.
you want to pause
So,
it?
and I apologize, I was juggling about 3 balls all of a sudden. So,
Young people
I'm
know how to do
sorry.
this.
and I'm taking a guess, it's Mr. Long, am I right? Yes. And did I get your name right or wrong? Is it Lenore or Leora? Leona. Okay, well, I still 3 times the charm. Anyhow, welcome. So I think we could just take a real quick minute,
Sure,
let everybody run
absolutely.
around so we get to know everybody here. Tony, you want to start back there in the back and just say who you are? real quick?
Brad Cotterman.
Thomas Snyder.
Dan Long.
Leona Weinmiller.
Emily Calder.
I'm Dante Kemp.
David Aiken?
Sonia Aiken.
Elizabeth Barhorse.
Kelly Van Allen, sorry, choked on my apple there a little bit.
Chris McGrath.
John Miller.
Brenda Moran.
I'm Missy Bennett, so you've talked with me on the phone. Sorry in the passing.
That's great.
And now we know Father Amberger, and you know he's gonna be cracking the whip
Okay,
here, right?
Yep. Now we're gonna.
He's ready to get rolling again.
Claudia, would you mind? You don't have to close it hard or anything, but yeah. Wonderful. So, all right. So the next point that I kind of wrote down, and this isn't, I mean, it is somewhat chronological, but some of this overlaps, and it's just the Middle Ages. Sometimes, once again, the Middle Ages are portrayed as this oppressive time when yada, 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 blah, blah, blah. But actually, the Middle Ages was really quite a beautiful time. Not perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect time in any history. But the Middle Ages is when there was, well, in the West, put it this way, a lot of synthesis of culture and faith. So the faith informed culture. And so, not perfectly, but you had a lot of good elements of the faith just changing the culture in a very good way. Okay, just very simply put. And you had, so when the university system begins, there is a flourishing of culture, whether it be in science or art, philosophy. This is when some of those beautiful structures, churches especially, are built. So you have Notre Dame Cathedral that recently had destruction done to it. You had Chartres Cathedral, also in France. You had the beautiful cathedral in Cologne, Germany. All these magnificent just feats of almost stupendous, and the sort of the motto of this era of the church's history was faith-seeking understanding. So it's this notion that we believe, and so God is the very center of reality. But because God is logical, then there is a beautiful logic for us to understand, to appreciate. This is why science flourishes in the West, but it does not flourish in the East. Because the East at this point, not entirely, but has a lot of Islamic influence. And for Islam, for Christianity, God is logical. 2 and 2 equals 4. It always will. It always has. Whereas in the Islamic mindset, they have a misunderstanding of God's all-powerful nature, and so God can do anything. Well, yes, He can do anything, but can God make 2 and 2 equal 5? For us, we think no, because that's it actually is a contradiction. God doesn't. Contradictions can't exist, not because God's not powerful, all-powerful, but because they contradict each other.
Because He is.
Where in the Islamic mindset, God can make 2 and 2 equal 5 because He's God. And so there's not, well, if God can be just like here, there, everything, well, then there's not a reasonable kind of there's not a rhythm to everything. Whereas in the West, they said, hey, we can just, this is why the science, in other words, science develops and really beautifully develops in the West much more so than in the East. Okay. So one of the high points, it was a Not a perfect time, but a beautiful time.
We're still on number 9, right?
No, 10.
This was actually number 10. So number 9 was the Crusades.
Middle Ages.
Number 10, the Middle Ages. They kind of do interconnect because most of the, all of the Crusades are happening within the Middle Ages, but it's a little bit of a different aspect, I guess. So number 11, this is not one of the better times in the church's history. There are two things I put under this title, or this number. One is called the Avignon Papacy.
I'm not gonna spell that.
So Avignon, A is in Adam, V is in Victor, I-G-N-O-N, Avignon, the Avignon Papacy. So, kind of what, this is from 1305 to 1377. Not that it's important that you know those dates, but if you want to have some sense of where this is happening, when this is happening. So what's happening? Well, to put it quite bluntly, basically the cardinals who were electing the Pope through different elements, different kind of things happening, they elected a French Pope, and the French Pope kind of went back to France, and they lived in Avignon, and well, he never left. And then the next Pope, well, he also lived in Avignon, and the next Pope, and the next Pope, and quite a few popes. For 70 years, the popes all lived in Avignon. What's the big difference? Well, Peter went to Rome. He was the first bishop of Rome. He died a martyr's death in Rome. Kind of important, to say the least. Now, was the Pope or the popes, when they lived in Avignon, France, were they still popes? Absolutely. Was this good for the church? No. Because at this point in the history of the church, which I didn't really talk about, but there was one of the early, I want to say, I don't know if it was Charlemagne or if it was before him, I can't remember. Someone that donated a whole swath of land to the papacy, basically, you know, so that they might have more protection. Because back then, you know, land did help protect you from marauding enemies. So it was the beginning of what was called the Papal States. Okay. And maybe about a third of Italy. Anyway, that was kind of a safe haven from all political influence and this and that. It's one of the reasons why it was good for the Pope to be in Rome, because he wasn't anybody's Pope. He was just the Pope. Unfortunately, what kind of helped, what started to develop was, oh, the Pope, where does he live? In France, still. So who's controlling the Pope? I bet you it's those French people. So if you were Italians, they were kind of a bit of a muddled, I mean, you had the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Sicily, but you had Italy was not united. So, but the Germans looked and said, hey, wait a second, this is ridiculous. And the English, like, this is crazy. So it started planting some seeds in England and in Germany. Hey, the Pope is kind of connected to the French kingdom. Well, under a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, more sweat and tears, of especially two particular women, saints, St. Bridget of Sweden, St. Catherine of Siena. St. Catherine of Siena was used by God to be a bold witness to basically get the Pope moved back to Rome. It worked. Pope returned to Rome. All things were good until he died. So there was a new, what they call conclave. Yes?
Was it during the time that they were in France that there was a lot of, like, not good kind of stuff that the popes were doing? I mean,
Well,
is that when they
that
had,
would
like,
be more in the Renaissance era.
Oh, okay.
That would be later on. Although, you know, sinners abound. You know, so sinners in the church everywhere.
Okay.
And if you ever wonder,
Because
yeah,
because
so
there was, I thought there was a point where where they were linked more to France, that there were some mistresses and stuff like that involved.
probably
But that's
more
later.
so the Renaissance.
Okay.
Yeah. If you ever think, hey, the church, everybody should look just like me. Oh, wait a second. I'm a sinner. Yep. So all we have to do is look in the mirror and recognize, yes, I, a sinner, am a member of the church. All right. So we're all sinners, you know. That doesn't in any way, shape, or form make it okay. No, absolutely not. But it's the reality, so we should not, as the saying goes, do not leave Peter, first pope, because of Judas.
Yeah.
So, but the Avignon papacy ended, sometimes referred to as the Babylonian captivity of the church, because the Babylonian captivity in the Jewish era, in the Old Testament, lasted 70 years. This Avignon papacy lasted 70 years. Everything was good. Gregory was somebody or another. I can't remember which Gregory it was. He's back in Rome. Looks good. He dies. Well, this could be a little dicey. So the cardinals gather. Most of the cardinals are, no surprise, French. They gather in Rome, and they hold an election. And they elect, I think it's Urban the Sixth or something like that. Somebody who became, and it looks good. Looks good until Urban's like, he is a no-nonsense, brass tacks kind of what you would imagine. No insult intended by this, but sort of a Marine drill sergeant kind of pope. He's going to reform the church. Boy, he takes. I mean, he's not literally smacking people around, but he's smacking them around, and these French cardinals are like, what? They're not happy. They get back to France and they say, you know what? We were scared to death of those Italian mobs, you know, the mafia. The mafia is not just a new thing. So the Italian scene and the Roman scene in particular always had that real kind of, sort of a little bit of a questionable kind of character. So anyway, nothing new under the sun. So they get back to France and they're like, hey, you know what? We were completely scared to death because we were threatened by these Italian mobs that we had to elect an Italian. We were completely not free to do this, so we're going to hold a new election. And they did. They elected a new pope. Well, it wasn't really the pope, but they elected a man who said, yeah, sure, I'll be the pope. So now you've got two men. One's the pope and one's claiming to be the pope. And this, unfortunately, this starts in 1378, so year after the whole Avignon papacy ends, and it lasts for 40 years. In fact, it gets so bad at one point, there's actually, and I don't remember the exact, there's actually 3 men who are claiming to be the pope. Actually, there's one pope, and there's 2 other men who are claiming to be the pope. It is an absolute mess. Absolute mess. Even some of the saints got confused. They're like, hey, I'm supporting this guy. Well, it turned out that he wasn't really the pope. It is just a total mess in that sense. You know, finally, basically the real pope would say, you know what, I am willing to step down if he's willing to step down, and he's willing to step down, and let's just start this whole thing over. So the real pope was willing to step down. One of the fake popes was willing to step down. The other pope said, absolutely not. Well, I think one of them got a little pressure on but the Holy Roman Emperor is like, you're stepping down. Well, no, I'm not, you're stepping down. You know, kind of one of those deals. And the other one, I think just, I don't know exactly. Somehow, they elected a new pope. Can't remember the pope's name, not important. And end of what was called the Great Western Schism. But once again,
Is this still number 11?
Yeah, so
Okay,
this
sorry.
is still number 11. Yep.
Okay.
So
Great Western
the
Schism.
Great Western Schism, yes. So it's different than the schism between the East and the West. Great Western Schism. But one of the effects that this had was, once again, kind of making, I mean, when you got, you're like, well, who knows which one's the Pope? I mean, the average person's like, well, I don't know. it almost started making the papacy more and more irrelevant. Bad seeds are being planted. So, after that, this is point number 12, is the era referred to as the Renaissance. Now, this kind of goes about this time, about 1400 to 1600, maybe about 2 centuries. The Renaissance, in some respects, there were some good things that happened in the Renaissance. Kind of a discovery of some of the classics, the Greeks and things of that nature. And that's all good and stuff in many ways. But there was kind of a shift. There was starting to be a little bit of a shift between kind of looking at things in a worldly way. Instead of looking at things through the eyes of faith, it's looking at them kind of in more of a worldly sense, okay? Kind of an increased importance or emphasis on, hey, look what we can do versus what God does through us. So a little bit of a shifting in that sense. This was a time of, art was really, there were good things that were happening. Some of the Renaissance popes were complete morons when it came to the spiritual. I mean, some of them they might be burning in hell for all we know. It was not a pretty time. This is, for example, when the Sistine Chapel was painted. Michelangelo and everything. I mean, so in some there was some beautiful things done, some very wonderful things done, but we were starting to get off some abuses were coming in. Okay. Coming after that, this is point number 13. And I don't mean any insult by this, but I'm just trying to be accurate. So if you're coming from a Protestant background, just kind of hear me out. So oftentimes, history is often told from a certain perspective. Understandable. So, for example, have you all heard of Good Queen Bess before? And Bloody Mary?
Yeah.
Guess what? Good Queen Bess was a Protestant queen who butchered Catholics. Bloody Mary was a Catholic queen that tried to reinstitute or bring back the Catholic faith. You ever heard about the Spanish Armada? And we're like, thank goodness the Spanish Armada failed. Oh, yay, England. Wait, it's not, we most of our history in this country, and it's just reality. I'm not saying there's anything bad about it, but we are looking at it from a Protestant perspective. It's just that is reality. We are a Protestant country for the most part. Well, not anymore. Who knows exactly what we would kind of be classified as. But historically speaking, we are predominantly a Protestant country, okay, with a lot of Catholic elements to it. But so when we hear about, we're like the Protestant Reformation. Well,
We're a rebellion.
yeah, that's not really maybe that's one perspective. You have and like I said, just please hear me out on this one. Another perspective would be the Protestant Revolt and the Catholic Reformation. Okay, so what's all happening here? So we have, 3 main figures: Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Ulrich Zwingli. Okay. Luther's kind of the one leading the charge initially. So kind of in the 1517 is when he begins. Everything was not perfect. But if you look at church history, it was never, ever perfect. And there have been some dark times. The 9th century, the 10th centuries, those were some dark times. Those were not pretty times. Now, I'm not talking about just because of the barbarians. So it's not like this time, the 16th century, was the absolute cesspool and everything was, no. And a lot of things that are said to have been all the things that were wrong, well, there were problems. but they're not always as they have been reported to be. Honestly, and I'm not an expert on Martin Luther by any means, but the little bit that I've read about him, honestly, I think if he had had a good father, a good, kind, loving man who was his father, I don't think we would have this. And that may appear to be insulting, but when you read a little bit of the history of his relationship with his father was, and I'm going to just say he was a jerk, and that's a very nice way to put it. He was horrible, horrible. I mean, your heart goes out to Martin Luther, just thinking the poor boy, you know. His father was just a nasty, wicked man, you know. And one of the things, and if you've ever heard me talk much about this, the whole thing with the father wound, you know, I think Martin Luther and so many people, when they struggle with their relationship with the earthly father, often that gets sort of put on to their relationship with God the Father. Initially, Martin Luther had no desire to break from the church. Okay, he was not some whacked out rebel. He did point out some authentic things that needed to change. There were some things that were deeply problematic in his theology, you know. And I'm not an expert, and I'm not even going to try to go into all that. But a lot of things went wrong. Martin Luther had a lot of personal struggles. He was haunted, I think, in so many ways, with a very, very broken relationship with his earthly father that carried over in many ways. And I'm not. These things can be validated relatively easily. And I think when he nailed his 95 Theses to the church door of Wittenberg, that was not a revolutionary act. That was kind of I think the poor door must have looked like crap then. But that's kind of how people posted things. You didn't have, bulletin boards and stuff. That's kind of how they, so it was to be debated. And so his initial intent was not to break away from the Catholic faith. It sort of just started going in that direction. I think the church did not take him seriously. And by the time the church started to take him seriously, it had kind of gotten a little deep. Simply put, most of the German princes could care less what Martin Luther said theologically. They were just like, hey, so I can still be a good Christian and have all this land and power from the church? I'm in. It had more to do with politics for them, not with Martin Luther, but for them, many of these German princes, than it had to do with religion. Okay. It was something that so the seeds were being planted before this. Remember when I said in the Avignon papacy, in England, in Germany, there were those, and they were actually harboring in England and in Germany basically heretics who were kind of like, well, you don't really have to be, you can be, sort of that whole idea of a national church was already developing before Martin Luther even came onto the scene. He's just the one, in a sense, that lit the match and ignited the tinder, and it just went up. Remember years ago, probably 30 years ago or something, the big fire out in Yellowstone National Park, it burned with such intensity because the Forest Service, or the National Park Service, basically had a no burn. They never allowed anything, so it just the tinder basically, the dead biomass just kept building up, and man, when that thing went, it just was unstoppable. That's what, in many ways, what happened. There was already that, through the Avignon papacy, through the Great Western Schism, already laid seeds to be like, you know what, we don't really need to be in union with, this Pope guy, whatever, we don't even know who he is, which one is the right one. So kind of a certain irrelevance a certain sense of, you know what, we can do this on our own. And the Renaissance, and there were some terrible examples, of some of the clergy, in the time of the Renaissance. Not the only time, but and then there was that more of the humanistic sense of, okay, well, let's see, what's our plan, and it's very simplistic what I'm saying here. So to paint Martin Luther as he was trying to, I think initially, I think you could say he was trying to point out some of the problems. He had some solutions, and some of the solutions were terrible. They were just completely off the mark. I mean, he really did not have, some of his theological conclusions were just, and you could read his own words, and you could see, like, I'm not so sure if that's right, But he ignited the spark, in a sense, and it just took off, unfortunately. Something that he did that I don't think he had any intention of doing, but would be a pivot point for the future and something that we are experiencing and probably will experience a lot more. Martin Luther said, look, his view of human nature was, and he just, he was a rather graphic sort of, Calvin was a little more sophisticated in his theology, still very convoluted and wrong in many ways. Martin Luther just kind of said it as he thought it, and sometimes you're like, well, that was rather crass image. So he said, human nature, we're just a pile of dung. We are corrupt. And the way we're justified by God's grace, by the blood of Christ, it's like the snow that just covers the pile of dung. It looks nice, but guess what? Still inside, it's just a pile of manure. And the church says, no, we are wounded, absolutely, but we're not a pile of dung, okay? And justification, we'll get into this more when we get to that point. No, it actually transforms us. It's not just covering us over, okay? So Martin Luther said, hey, in the Middle Ages, faith and reason, faith seeking understanding, faith and reason went hand in hand. This is why you had in that period of time, you had such a beautiful, cultivation of the sciences and things of that nature. And Martin Luther said, faith and reason. All right, and I'm obviously really roughly paraphrasing here. Reason is affected by our human nature, and our human nature is completely corrupt. So reason, bad. So he divided the two. He divorced the two. And he basically said, we don't need reason. I think he had some choice words about that. Faith alone, saved by faith alone. This is why, for example, he said, well, when he translated the Bible in German, he translated in St. Paul's epistle to the Romans that we were saved by faith alone. He put in the word alone. Even his followers said, I don't think you can do that. I don't think you can add words to the sacred scriptures. They eventually took that out. But it was faith and faith alone. Okay. Kind of keep that in the back of your mind, because that's going to go into the next point. But so the church responded. Okay, the church responded. It was kind of a slow response for different reasons. Lots of wars were being fought. It was a bloody, bloody time in many ways.
Okay, is this still 13?
Still 13.
Okay.
So it's the Protestant Revolt and the Catholic Reformation. The Catholic Church responded and cracked down on some of the abuses, right? The abuses that were true. Some of the things that were the church was being accused of really weren't abuses. And clearly started defining things. Okay, yes, we believe this. No, we do not believe, et cetera, et cetera. So, and you had this great, really this period. This is when like Saint Ignatius of Loyola, when he founds the Jesuit order, major influence in this era. Not enough time to go into this. That this could be, this is a college level class for 10 weeks at least, just on one of these topics, let alone both of these topics together. But this divides Christendom, and now for the first time, in any significant factor, you have Christians, some are Catholic and some are Lutheran or Calvinist or whatever, and from this point forward, beginning with Martin Luther, Well, Luther and Zwingli and Calvin kind of start different branches, if you will. From that point forward, now for the about 500 years, or well, yeah, 500 plus 1 or 2 years, 2 years, I guess. You have somewhere on the order of something like, it's over 30,000 different Protestant
Close to
denominations.
40,000 now.
So now some of those are tiny little minuscule like storefront. I mean, you've got major, so all of your different Protestant denominations, you can all trace backwards. So who started this one, who started that, who started that, and it comes back down to, you know, Calvin and Zwingli and Luther in that sense. So it's the first time in the church's history that, because even though the Orthodox, the East, doesn't accept the Pope, and at this point hasn't accepted the Pope for, you know, 500 years, they will still say, well, of course we have all the sacraments. We have 7 sacraments, we've got bishops, etc., etc. Whereas, you know, Luther and you know, Zwingli and Calvin are, you know, like, nope, 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 you know, and they start, you know, so it is what it is, you know. Yeah, so we're just kind of, if I go any further, then we'll never get through this night. Okay. What does this go? So point number 14, we're getting close to the end. The Enlightenment, or as I like to refer to as the so-called Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Okay. So what happens with Martin Luther divorces faith and reason. In the medieval period, there's this beautiful synthesis, not for the first time, but just a beautiful flowering of that. Faith and reason coming in. Faith seeking understanding. Martin Luther divorces the two. I don't think with any understanding of what could potentially happen. The next generation, or more or less, because the Enlightenment, kind of 17th century, you know, that next generation says, faith? We need faith. That's a bunch of hooey. All we need is reason. So faith can, once you divorce those two, they're uncoupled. You can divert this part of the train over there, you can put this part of the train over there. It doesn't make any difference. They're no longer joined together. So you can do with them as you want. Faith got thrown out the window. People did not hang on to the faith component that terribly long. Now it's all about reason. Okay. Now, this really kind of the father of all of this, in a sense, the father of modern or modern Western philosophy, I guess you could say, was a French mathematician, actually a Catholic, not exactly one of her prouder moments, brilliant mathematician, so Cartesian geometry and all that kind of good stuff. I say that because I'm not a math guy, but I know it's good. You know, it's all good stuff. You know, all that great stuff. Yep, brilliant man, brilliant mathematician, terrible philosopher. So Rene Descartes, R-E-N, is it E-E?
Just one.
One E, R-E-N-E, and then D-E-S-C-A-R-T-E-S.
Correct.
So Rene Descartes. So he was one day thinking to himself, hey, you know what? I can doubt the existence of everything. I can doubt the existence of all of you. I can doubt the existence of this room. I can doubt the existence of this table and this chair and the crickets I hear, the cicadas I hear outside. I can doubt the existence of these buildings and the sky. I can doubt the existence of God. I can doubt the existence of everything. Except for the fact that I can't deny the fact that I'm thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Hence the famous phrase, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. How do I know that I exist? Because I'm thinking. Now it's somewhat circular in some respects. In the medieval mindset, how do I know I exist? Because God exists. I know God exists, and therefore everything else exists. God is the center of reality. Now in the so-called Enlightenment, God's not the source and the center of all reality. I am, you are, we are. This is where we get in that very dangerous slide to say, well then therefore, and we, so this tsunami, if you will, that is coming, is not come ashore completely, I don't think, is coming ashore, was started many centuries ago. It's like out in the ocean, and it's coming. We already are feeling this effect, because how many times do people say in today's culture, you know what? You can't tell me what to do. Now, this isn't just little kids saying that. We hear that from little kids all the time. But these are adults. You can't tell me that it's wrong. If I think it's right, then it's right for me. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You're not going to tell me what to do. You know? What is this? Basically, it's back to the very beginning. That temptation from the enemy. Oh, if you eat the fruit, you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. Knowing good and evil is not, hey, I know this is hot and this is cold. That's not knowing good and evil. That Semitic understanding, it's basically saying, no, you'll be like God. You will determine for yourself what is good and what is evil. If you say it's good, it's good. If you say it's evil, it's evil. You make the call. So this is where the Enlightenment, this is where you get some crazy ideas, and you start developing all this modern philosophy of whether it be in Sartre or Heidegger, or Karl Marx, or I don't know. I'm not a philosopher, so I don't know all these terrible, will to power, all this terrible evil stuff that has done a heck of a lot of evil, let's just say. Now, in the midst of all this, this is where my voice is starting to kind of shake a little bit here. I think we only have 12 minutes. So in the midst of all this is not good, and we're going to get to what this really, in a very ugly way, leads to. But you do have the scientific revolution. Not a bad time in some respects. Guess who is really a major force behind the scientific revolution? The church. Don't have enough time to go into this tonight, but the whole Galileo thing, that's most of what we have heard and understand, complete fabrication, not the truth. But the church is, fostering in this, and it's really taken off, Copernicus, he's a Catholic priest, or at least a cleric at the time, it's all this, it's a lot of good stuff happening here as well, but sort of an explosion. Point number 15, getting close to the end here. I would call this the era of revolution. This is when, now the one that really just breaks loose. I mean, we're part of this revolution. We're part of this era of revolution. Most of our founding fathers are what you refer to as a deist. Okay? All coming out of the Enlightenment. Okay? Deists would say, yeah, I believe God exists, but he just created everything. Classic example or image is he is like the divine watchmaker. He creates the watch, winds it up, lets it go. But even though our founders were deists, they were actually much better men than a lot of our politicians of the day today. They were actually, it's interesting. It takes a long time to beat God out of our culture. We're doing it. We're succeeding. That's good, isn't it? It takes a long time. These men were deists, but when you read the right, Ben Franklin saying, hey, we need to start the Continental Congress off with prayer. And it's like 2 hours later. Seriously? If I would even suggest, we're going to pray for a half hour, people would flip out.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that that's the be-all, end-all, but I mean, it's interesting. Now, not everything, but I mean, so we're in the age of revolution.
So
Now-
what's a deist?
A deist is someone who believes God exists, but believes that God has nothing to do with his creation. He's basically just let it, it's on, you're on your own, on your own,
He starts it and just lets it go.
Now, to kind of cast the whole revolutionary era, usually, and I, proud to be an American, I love my country, so this is no slapping. But we are taught to believe kings, bad, democracy, good. That is a terribly naive way to look at history, okay? Is democracy good? Sure, it's good. It can be good, you know. We aren't technically a democracy, we are a republic. But I mean, democracy, it's good. There are many good things, you know, absolutely. But to say, oh, kingdoms, bad. First of all, religiously speaking, which is the ultimate reality, our sovereign is a king. We are in a kingdom, whether we like it or not. You know, our Lord is, you know, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But even if you look historically, you sometimes had some lousy kings. But even lousy kings, if you were, you know, Joe Farmer or, you know, whoever, usually you didn't really have much. We have this idea, which I think sometimes there's a bit of propaganda, that kings were tyrannical. They just demanded. Usually, a lot of times, you didn't really have much. It's a bit of an overstatement to characterize all kings as bad. All these wonderful, heroic people that are just thrown off of these kingdoms, and finally, and not always. If you want to read something very beautiful, and maybe I'll try to find it and bring it in. It's really usually because the poster child for this era, you know, and to say, hey, this is great. Well, maybe it's not really great, but we're not going to say that. We're just going to say, that's great. Yes, we're all for liberty and brotherhood and whatever else. French Revolution. That was a bloodbath. You know, there's no two ways around that one. And you think, well, thank goodness they got, you know, that Marie Antoinette was probably a bit naive in some respects. But when you look at that family, what they went through, and how Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, how they prepared their children for what was coming. I mean, I just had the chills come down to me. They were God-fearing Catholics. They were unbelievable in many ways. They weren't perfect, but Marie Antoinette was begging her children, and I think Louis, I can't remember the story, but they were begging her children, forgive them. You know, you don't get that with tyrannical, you know, bloodthirsty, you know, whatever. When one of the girls, one of the youngest girls, I can't remember, I have to look at that, I have to find this story. It's just such a beautiful, gut-wrenching story. And when she knew she was going to be, I mean, she would write on her cell wall, I forgive them. Time after time after, she just constantly write, I forgive them. I mean, just, it really, really amazing. What they did to his son is diabolical. Absolutely diabolical. I mean, they abused him, I'll just leave it at that. It's absolutely hideous. So, the French Revolution is like, well, it was just a little misguided. Oh, no. Well, it was guided, all right. It was guided by Satan himself. You know? Interestingly enough, there were those in this country who were like, I don't think you don't get, this is not going. Our revolution was very different than the French Revolution. French Revolution, our revolution, well, I'm sure it wasn't perfect, but, you know, there was a goodness and something that was good about it, you know, in many ways. French Revolution, anyway. So, you know, when you are putting to the guillotine, you know, innocent nuns just because you're Catholic, you know, it's quite the, anyway, so lots, explosion, and even they're like, oh, we're going to tamp this down. This is not going the right direction. You know, Napoleon Bonaparte and all the 9 yards with that. And then you have all the, you know, and a lot of these revolutions, they're rather bloody revolutions. And this goes, you know, in this whole period, the French Revolution, after the French Revolution, it scared the Europeans. And so you have the council, or not the council, the Congress of Vienna, the great statesman, Metternich, the Austrian statesman, trying to, and then, but you got still in this age of revolution, you know, and sometimes it's okay, and sometimes it's just bloody, and, you know, probably one of the last of the revolutions was was communism. You know, in fact, was it just 2 years ago? I guess it was the 100th anniversary, and where they were like, okay, the Tsarist family, we killed him. You know, it was just anyway. It's interesting for all these royals who are so sometimes miscategorized as just despots and fiends, and thank goodness we killed them, we put them down. And you read about some of their lives. Tell you what, one of the last of the, I mean, and I don't mean this in a pompous, like, egotistical, like, well, I'm so much better than anybody else. I'm not. But if you want to hear, well, I'm kind of flipping a little bit ahead, but we're almost done here. Yeah, we're almost done. Yeah. The story of he's now blessed Karl of Austria and his wife Zita, who died many years later as a widow.
Austria?
Of Austria. This was during World War I. You know, it's just anyway. Well, maybe we'll get to that. But
I think they're in that book that you recommended, the saints of not necessarily married couples, but a lot of.
Oh yes, I think yes. So
I did read that.
He actually, you can YouTube. You can see a little video
Zita.
clip of their wedding. So Zita, and she's now venerable. She died, like I said. Well, beautiful story. Anyway, it's a beautiful example of an authentically wonderful Catholic royal couple who wanted to do everything to serve their people. Anyway, the world just is like, well, whatever. We're not going to use for you people anymore. Anyway, long story. My point 16. We'll do these real quick. Point 16. I just kind of put out modernism. You know, and that's not that the church is against modern things. Okay, modernism is just as a title that kind of describes the heresy of today, if you will. Modernism, Modernism is what we're dealing with now. Modernism, I'll give you an example. Modernism would look at something and say, something of the faith and say, well, that's what they used to believe years ago, but now, you know, we know better than that, you know. And so we judge everything according to our standards now. Now, modernism in many ways is a synthesis of so many different heresies. Modernism basically says we're in charge and we will make, in a sense, we will determine what is right and what is wrong. You know, a classic scriptural example of modernism is like, well, you know, when Jesus was out there in the wilderness and lots of people there and they were all getting hungry, and he did a miracle. It's called a miracle of sharing. So they took the little bit that they had and shared it with everybody. And everybody else was like, well, gosh, if they're going to share the little they have, well, then I can share my sandwich with somebody over here, and I can do it. Or, well, Jesus didn't really walk on water. You see, it's kind of a low part of the sea there, and there were rocks, and he was just walking on the rocks. But then it looked like he was walking on water, or he didn't really raise this, or he didn't really rise from the dead. Modernism has the net effect of saying, you know what? Religion is whatever you want it to be. Whatever you want to make it to be, that's perfectly fine. In fact, we'll give you the support for it. You know, modernism is a hard thing to define because it's like a Medusa. It's got all kinds of heads all over the place, you know. But you can always, if modernism is that whole sense of, you know, I think, therefore I am. I'm in charge. I will determine, you know what, that's not good for me, so therefore it's not true. You know, modernism has powerfully affected our culture. And we'll get into these things more and more. And then my last point, and I'm 1 minute over, I just put down Vatican II, just because that's going to be a phrase or a term that you hear. It's the last, at this point, the last church council that we had. It was from 1961 to 1965. I got my dates right. I think it was 61 to 65. No, it was, or 62 to 65. I don't even remember. That's terrible. Anyway, it's math. I can't remember. So you will hear people say, "Oh, well, that's pre-Vatican II." You know, this is, I don't have enough time to get into, so we'll get into sort of, because it's so important for us to understand. And I'm not going to go into great detail on this at this point, but it will kind of be throughout. So these are just points I want to be throughout, so I can just say, "Hey, you remember when I said this or that?" You can kind of say, "Oh, yeah, okay, you have a little bit of an idea." But just put it this way. Sometimes you will hear people say, especially if you talk to older Catholics, some older Catholics, not all older Catholics, but some older Catholics, "Oh, well, we used to believe that. We don't believe that anymore." Or that's how we used to do things. And do things change? Absolutely. Guess what? In the early church, if you committed some really serious sins of like murder, adultery, or apostasy from the faith, you would have to do public penance maybe for years. You might be kneeling in front of the church begging for prayers of people as you're going into the church and to go to Mass. Well, sure, things change. Is that how we do it anymore? No. It's probably better that way. I don't know how many people really want to be like, "Yeah, I'd like to be a public penance." So yes, absolutely. The church is not a museum. Do things change? Absolutely. Now, does the faith change? No. So if we've always believed something, we will always believe that. The faith is rock solid. Hopefully we come to a deeper appreciation and understanding. So there are definitely things that can change. We'll get into all this, but if you hear someone say, "Oh, we don't do that anymore." Really? Are you sure? Because for some, it's a convenient line in the sand to say, "Oh yeah," and some people have just been misinformed, and some people try to use it to say, "Oh wait, that was that pre-Vatican II church. That was that first, 1965 years of the church. We don't do those things anymore. We're a new church." See, it's that modernistic mindset. Now, the Second Vatican Council did not, a lot of things that the council said that people just ignore because it doesn't work into their bigger picture. And there are things that they said that people were just like, "Well, we'll interpret that slightly differently." If the council was followed exactly how the council laid itself out, things would be very different in many ways. Too many things to go into at this point. I just wanted to throw that out there. We'll talk about that more, but we are solidly out of time. So. Are there any questions? That's a very short, believe it or not, short walk, run, jaunt through 2,000 years of church's history. So.
I have a question. Were you able to upload?
The video is uploaded.
Okay.
Yes. So it's Holy Angels
I found some from like
last year.
3 months ago and 6 months ago. So if I go to just that Holy Angel Sidney, I should be able to find it. Okay.
I'll try to remember to send out. I gotta get through PSR tomorrow night, but by the end of the week, I'll try to send out an email with the link in there. Does that work?
I don't think I get any emails. You just have, I'm a sponsor. Oh, okay. Okay.
Or
So-
send me her email and I'll add it.
Next week, we will start with the creed. We're gonna dive in. What does it mean to say "I believe"? Now, believe it or not, that's going to take weeks. 2 words. It's going to take weeks, but it's going to be good. It's going to be great. It's going to be all kinds of good Catholic stuff.
I did bring over Father, these books, Rediscover Catholicism by Matthew Kelly, and so I'd like to offer them all to you guys here tonight. It's a nice read. I can tell you when my son and I were coming through the church, it's something that we read together. It might be taken more from cradle Catholics, kind of walking away, coming back. But it is a nice kind of way to walk into the Catholic faith, I think. And Matthew Kelly has a lot of good stuff in here just by nature to help you with Mass and just some good Catholic habits. So take a pass around.
We give you a blessing, and then you can kind of leave at your leisure. So may Almighty God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, God bless you all.
Thank you, thank you.
Pleasure.
It was so funny, I was thinking you were somebody else that looked like you, when it's all really just you. Here.
I'm ready.
Oh, you have one? Yeah. Do you have
I
one?
have one, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have some too.